And the third and final consensus is what I call the global village consensus, because on the one hand, while I'm pessimistic about the ability of governments to rise above their national interests to address the global challenges that we face, on the other hand, if you look at populations around the world and you look at civil society, the awareness among the peoples in the world that we are all on the same boat or in the same global village is rising faster and faster. So we can sit at a conference like this and come from so many different parts of the world and feel comfortable talking to each other without feeling that we are crossing some impossible barriers. So the chemistry of global civil society has changed significantly and is continuing to change. And that's why I say that the next 20 years will be the best 20 years that the world has ever seen. Thank you very much.
So we have a few minutes for questions and answers, and I will launch this very short debate by one observation and two short questions. The observation is that this afternoon, actually, we have a plenary session on Europe as a laboratory for global governance. That looks a little bit paradoxical in this time of crisis, but the reason why I decided actually to have such a roundtable is exactly the one that Kishore gave you, that is, Europe is today an area where there is not only a zero war, but zero prospect of war. I think that's a very nice way of formulating this. However, I would add that if ever the European Union were starting to dismantle, in a few years' time, we might find again a situation where the probability of wars would no longer be zero. That's why the immediate stakes are so high, and that's where the euro itself enters the picture. So that's my observation. Now, two quick questions, one very short term and one very long term. The short term question is, you said, Kishore, that after Dominique Strauss-Kahn resignation from the IMF, there was an opportunity missed. But my question is, who is responsible for that? Is it not the emerging countries themselves who were unable to decide on a candidacy? So I think it will be interesting to have your viewpoint on this short-term issue. Now, my long-term question is, you say you're optimistic for the next 10 years, but when you dream of the world in the year, let's say, well, 2100, how do you see it?
I must thank Thierry for asking me two very difficult questions. The first one actually is easier. You know, if you are a candidate from an emerging country running for the IMF, and the voting was on the basis that you had one country, one vote, then you have a chance to win because you will easily get 100 votes or more from the emerging countries out of 193 votes, right? But if the voting system in IMF is such that the United States has 17% of the vote, the EU has 32% of the vote, and the rest of the West, Canada, Australia, New Zealand have 3% of the vote, the West, which has 12% of the world's population, has 52% of the vote starting the race. So if you do your calculations, you as an emerging country candidate will say, what's the point of it all? I'm going to lose there's no way I can get that 52% of the Western vote. So the system has got to be changed. I think, Jakob, you mentioned it in your remarks earlier. You got to change this 12% of the world's holding 52% of the IMF vote, and that will come, I think. But in terms of where I see the world in the year 2100, number one, I'm pretty confident I will not be there. But I actually increasingly have become, and here I must confess that I have to acknowledge a fact that Thierry mentioned earlier, that I've become more arrogant, even more arrogant. And I believe that what you're going to see is not just the Asian century, but the Asian millennium. Because Asia always had the world's largest population in the world. But the Asia also had the world's largest pool of brains. But even though we had the world's largest pool of brains, we also had the world's largest pool of unused brains. Now the world's largest pool of unused brains is being used in Asia. And believe me, you will be absolutely astonished by what is going to come out of Asia in the next 100 years. So I've become far more bullish about the future of Asia in the next 100 years.
But why don't you ever mention Africa?
Actually, I'm very glad you mentioned that, because one of the things that I really enjoyed seeing on my flight here was the copy of The Economist. As you know, you were seeing on the flight here, and the cover story is Africa Rising. And I actually believe I've become far more optimistic about Africa, partly because, incidentally, more and more African leaders are coming to visit Asia. And the fact that they can see how Singapore, which used to have a per capita income the same as Ghana's, in 1965, when Singapore became independent, we had the same per capita income as Ghana. And today, our per capita income is higher than that of our colonial master, the United Kingdom. So they can see that if you want to learn how to do it, go to Asia.
Thank you very much. So I have two questions, Dominique Moisy and Jacob Frankel.
Kishore, that was a brilliant presentation, but I can't resist the temptation to try to take you out from your non-Western, non-democratic comfort zone. So when you are presenting the weaknesses of the West, I can only agree with you. American democracy has become dysfunctional. Vetocracy is endangering democracy. And China has two strategic advantages vis-à-vis the West. It can act quickly because it is not democratic, and it can think long-term because it is Chinese. We cannot act quickly and we cannot think long-term. But now, let's come to Asia. And I see two problems. The first one is that the more successful you will become, the more Asian will want to live like the West. You will not want maybe to be governed like us, but you will want your values to look a bit more like ours in terms of treatment of inequalities, in terms of respect for human rights. And for the moment, I do not see people dreaming of becoming Chinese or becoming Singaporean. You still have many people in the world who want to become American, or even today, to join the European dream. So I think you have a problem in the long term with universalism. Yes, I agree with you. The torch of history has moved from the West to Asia, but you have structural disadvantages which you have to face.
Well, I'm a very good friend. Very glad that my good friend Dominique asked me a very challenging question. And, by the way, I want to emphasize, when you give a 20-minute speech, you obviously cannot go into all the nuances and the qualifications and all that. I can tell you, by the way, the rise of Asia will not be one straight line upwards, okay? It'll be up and down and up and down, and there'll be many challenges that the Asian states will have to overcome, the same geopolitical challenges that there are in the rest of the world. So I acknowledge all the difficulties. But on the question of values, Dominic, I hope you don't mind if I give you a rather spirited response. A good friend, so I know I can do this with you. There is a perception in the West that somehow the most civilized societies, in one way or another, are in the West, and the job of the rest, the remaining 88%, is to try and become as civilized as the West. That's a kind of a hidden assumption that comes out in the questioning. And here, in response to that, I recommend to you a book written by an Indian academic who teaches in Harvard, and you all know who he is, Amartya Sen. The book is called The Argumentative Indian. It's a series of essays. And in one of his essays, he points out with great historical detail how many of the values that the West claims to be quote-unquote Western actually came from the East, including tolerance, acceptance of diversity, and so on and so forth. So don't take my word for it. Take Amartya Sen's word for it. And I can tell you, by the way, that Asians are like any other human beings in the world. And I always emphasize, Asians don't like to have their fingers pulled out. Asians don't like to be shot in the head. Asians don't like to be imprisoned arbitrarily. All the values in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights are values that the Asians also want, clearly. But they will be balanced. And this is what's interesting in the coming dialogue that's going to happen. And I hope that it will be a dialogue among equals between East and West, where the reason why the Asian states are succeeding is they've always taken the best of the West and tried to use it, but they'll also take the best of the East. And in the future, if we can combine the best of the West and the best of the East, then I think we have a better world coming our way. And I think, Dominic, it can be done.